What's up, guys? So this is kind of a crossover between my original debunkings of some medieval weapons claims and my more typical debunkings of crazy creationists. So yes, that's right. Today we are looking at the king of the loons, NephilimFree. He said something last night on Modern Day Debate that just triggered me so freaking hard. Okay, let's move on so I don't give myself an aneurysm before I even start. This wasn't even the topic of the debate, the main topic at least, which was, did giants exist? And where Nephy was literally just reading fiction and myths with giants in them and claiming that this is evidence that giants really existed. Things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. He argues the same type of thing with depictions of dragons, and so because some people wrote about dragons and drew dragons, guess that means dragons existed for real. Someone drew it, therefore it must be real. So, in light of this startling and highly scientific evidence, I will now be on a mission to free all of the Pokemans from their slavery. Maybe not.
The Bible proves itself to be the inspired word of God, and it says there were men a great size. Then the King Og had a bed that was 13 feet long and made of iron. Why would the Bible say that this bed was so many feet long if it wasn't made for a man of enormous size and made out of iron? Because maybe it was made for a man that weighed 700 to 900, 1,100 pounds. That's why.
Or it was made for a man who slept with all of his concubines.
Okay, but a man that big, a man that tall.
Why would he have to be that big? If he has that many concubines, he'd need to.
Well, why would the ancients? Why would the ancients all across the world have legends of every culture? Here's the crazy thing, Jim. This legends of giants exist not just in Europe and not just in the Mideast, but in Africa, in Asia, China, Japan, all across Native Americans, all over the world. Now, if it wasn't true, if it wasn't true that giants did exist, then you'd have to believe that there is some crazy quirk about civilization itself that causes people to magically believe that giant men lived in the past. Now, what would that be, and how would that be logical?
Yeah, it's called exaggeration, Neph. Every culture tells myths. Are you suggesting all myths are real? That would mean other gods are real, like Thor and Loki and Athena and Zeus. Now, every culture makes things up. They exaggerate. Every culture tells stories about people, too. It's not a stretch to observe that every culture tells tales about big people. You know, things that already exist. Just bigger. Sort of like how floods happen, but cultures around the world told tales about extra big floods. Not really a stretch to say, yeah, they embellished a little bit. These aren't even made up things, just things that already exist, just bigger. Doesn't take any magic at all to do that. Anyway, as monumentally stupid as these arguments clearly are, I literally cannot overstate how mind-numbingly ass-backwards insulting to the very concept of thought itself that Nephy's arguments here are. That's something we've known about him for a long time, but what really truly triggered me was when he started just talking about ancient weaponry with the absolutely stunning confidence of the most Dunning-Kruger of all Dunning-Krugerites. The actual abortion that flowed from his mouth was that there are categorically no ceremonial weapons that are oversized.
I want to say this one thing and that'll be done. There are no such thing as ceremonial weapons that are of normal size.
Yes.
I know this is a random thing to get upset about, but this claim is just so abysmally stupid, so utterly deranged, that I truly lack words to even express the level of pure rage and level of dying brain cells that is happening right now. Nephi claims that there are categorically no oversized ceremonial weapons, and he does this for the express purpose of saying that since characters like Gilgamesh were said to have oversized weapons, this can only mean that these oversized weapons were wielded by actual giants and were not ceremonial. Because if it's possible for a huge weapon to be ceremonial, then it's possible for these mentioned weapons to not have been wielded by giants. But if there are no ceremonial oversized weapons, then all oversized weapons must have been wielded by giants. So, definitely not fiction. Jin Majors gives an excellent example of how Nephi is wrong, just right there in the middle of the debate. And surprise, surprise, Nephi just magically ignores it, as if it didn't happen.
Yes, there are such things as ceremonial weapons. I don't know what you know about the Temple of Knossos, but they would often slay a bull and pour its blood through this libation bowl. And archaeologists and people who studied the temple complexes at Knossos say that it was done with one of these double-headed, I believe they're called labras. Yeah, labras.
Well, you strawman me. You said I said there's no such thing as ceremonial weapons. I didn't say that. I said there's no such thing as ceremonial weapons of abnormal size. All ceremonial weapons known in history that have been passed down to kings or dukes or anything else have always been just normal sized weapons, just more elaborately made with more artisan.
That's not true. They're always larger.
You won't be able to show me an example. You won't be able to show me an example of
any king's sword.
Hold on, Jim, please. You won't be able to show me an example of a ceremonial weapon that's of abnormal size. There's no such thing. They're all normal-sized weapons that are outrageously ornate or made of precious materials, but they're not of abnormal size. Of abnormal size.
You just cannot reason with these people. You give them an example of what they say does not exist, and they just act like you didn't even say it, because they've already decided it's impossible for them to be wrong. Well, at least Nephi. So this absolute insult to any semblance of an alternate universe in the general vicinity of anything even approaching any type of similarity to a coherent thought is claimed as a categorical absolute fact, as if Nephi's an expert in this field. Meanwhile, it took me half a second to type in oversized ceremonial weapons to Google and enter, and you can instantly find hit after hit after hit for oversized ceremonial weapons from ancient times to modern. I know, guys, this isn't hard-hitting research, but I just can't with this guy. It's just too easy to fact-check the things he says with the most inappropriate level of confidence that it's possible for a human being to have. I know I've seen ceremonial weapons before, that were oversized, but I didn't know the names of any. But so it's less than trivially easy to look this up for yourself. And of course, Nephi picks this hill to die on because it's impossible for anything he says to be wrong. It's honestly just painful to live in the same reality as this person. Anyway, as if that wasn't enough, the other thing I wanted to address, he then goes on to talk about how spears are only designed to be throwing weapons.
This is how spears were used in ancient warfare. The soldier throws his spear or uses it in immediate contact.
Now, this is a little less obvious to the average person, so let me break this down for anyone who isn't on the same page already. The spear was by far the most used, most preferred, and main weapon used by soldiers throughout history. NephilimFree does not know the difference between a javelin and a spear. A javelin is a throwing spear. A spear is a not throwing spear.
When the battle gets too heated, he gets rid of the spear or throws it, and then he pulls out his sword, usually a short sword. The spear is a primary attack weapon, and then it's discarded, and they resort to a sword or a knife. Men of ancient technology and culture throw spears by hand. They don't run around jabbing people. The only people known
You're talking
to
about
use
javelins.
spears.
Javelins would not hold up in battle.
The only people known to hold spears in battle for any length of time was the Romans when they formed their formations.
In case anyone's confused by Nephi's usage of the word primary attack weapon, he does not mean it is the main weapon. What he means is that the weapon is used first. He says that the spear is thrown in first contact as a rule and then discarded. He then states it's unusual for armies to use spears for any length of time.
Men of ancient technology and culture throw spears by hand. They don't run around jabbing people. The only people known
You're talking
to
about
use
javelins.
spears.
Javelins would not hold up in battle.
The only people known to hold spears in battle for any length of time was the Romans when they formed their formations.
So any of his garbled nonsense about spears being the primary attack weapon and being discarded when the battle gets too heavy is just him being confusing. He actually said that the only usage of any and all spears is to be thrown, as a rule, and to not be used for extended periods of time in the main battle. Jim points out that Nephi is describing javelins and not spears, as spears were typically used throughout the entire battle. Swords were typically used if you lost your spear, but spears were preferred by almost every soldier of every army at every point in history.
Spears. The spears are not the mainstay weapon of any soldier, never have been. Spears are not the mainstay weapon of any soldier, never have been.
The dory spear was the main offensive weapon of the hoplite, used typically as a thrusting weapon.
And so, how often were swords picked as the primary weapon on a battlefield? Think about it. It's not much. It's not much at all, all right? They were there, okay, as backup weapons, backup weapons.
We have said many times that the most effective weapon and the most common weapon throughout the entire world from a militaristic point of view is the spear. If you look at samurai history, the spear has been constantly the preferred weapons of the samurai, both at least as far as samurai times are concerned. So it's already 1,000 years. And considering, depending on which area of Japan and what time we're talking about, even before that. So, and again, the Greeks, if we consider classical times, used the sarissa as their first weapon and the swords as their backup weapon, swords as their backup weapon, swords as their backup weapons, backup weapon.
Spears. The spears are not the mainstay weapon of any soldier, never have been. Of any soldier, never have been.
Never have been, huh? Let's see, the samurai preferred spears for almost 1,000 years. The Philippines, spear was the primary weapon. Africa was the primary weapon. China considered it the king of weapons. Pikemen were the main units used to defend the first riflemen. Cavalry were primarily armed with lances from Europe to Japan. Spears were the only defense against cavalry, too. And, quote, the dory spear was the main offensive weapon of the hoplite. Literature and primary sources all seem to disagree with you, Neph. Neph even contradicts himself and says Romans used spears as primary weapons. Which, yeah, eventually they did.
The only people known to hold spears in battle for any length of time was the Romans when they formed their formations with their shields in front and their spears sticking out of between the shields, right?
It was more than the Romans, but yeah.
Not remotely true. It's actually the exact opposite. The Romans were one of the only militaries in history that actually preferred swords over spears. They were the exception. The Greeks are way more well known for this, though the Romans did use their javelins as spears at times, and later did switch to more using primarily spears. I wonder if he's confusing the two here.
Right, but when the battle got too heavy, the spears were discarded. They pull out their sword. They carry a spear and a sword, just like the Bible describes in 2 Samuel.
No, only if you broke or lost your spear, and even then, at least in the case of hoplites, the other end of the spear could be used. It had a spike on the butt end that was also used as a weapon.
But why did he carry a spear and a sword? Well, because the spear is a primary attack weapon.
Now, when he says primary weapon, what he means is the weapon that's used first, not the main weapon that's used, contrary to how historians use the word.
You throw it, you take out one, maybe two guys right off the bat. Then
you don't throw it right off the bat. It's not used right. Okay, when the Romans had it, when the Romans had it,
hear what you guys have to say. So
I'm
we want to make sure that
Enough. How the hell do you kill two guys with one spear throw? Cartoon brain. Okay, so Homer says they'd go back to camp for a second spear rather than use the, quote, less effective short sword. Now, the spear absolutely dominates the sword in most conditions because of one simple rule. Reach. If I have the longer pointy thing, I can stab you before your pointy thing comes close to stabbing me. Simple. Universal. Easy to test.
A long pointy stick, basically, absolutely. It's a universal weapon, and it's pretty awesome as well against swords. And yet, a huge amount of money and effort and attention went into designing and building swords, and yet spears are sort of better, aren't they?
When anybody ever actually came up against someone armed with something like this, they found that they worked really well.
But these have to be better weapons, don't they? So, huge treatises written about how to use these, not how to use these. Yes, there's some that deal with these, but all the attention's on these. All the famous heroes from history use these.
Achilles is described as being fantastically skilled as a warrior by reference to his spear. He won cities by the spear.
I can only think that there must be some things that the sword is better at. There must be some scenarios where the sword triumphs. So I think there should be an experiment. I think we should look into this.
Pink Trousers has a problem. He can move about and parry with his sword to keep himself safe, but to have any chance of winning the bout, he has to close with his opponent, who outreaches him. Will he manage it? No. Another man tries his luck with a dagger. A bit of quarterstaff technique there. Can he close to stabbing distance? No. And tries a quick rush. Fails. Tries to grab the spear. Fails. And he's dead. Showing some aggression with the spear, using the full length of it there, at last. And he wins, waiting for a mistake to exploit. He forms a plan, and he's dead. Of futile violence. Look at the way he faces down that thrust. The man has nerves of steel. He makes a big, wide sweep with his buckler, gets stoutly thrust in the centre of his chest, but laughs it off and lunges in with a massive haymaker of an attack while swinging his buckler out way behind him, leaving him hopelessly exposed to another hit to his throat. This swordsman looks serious. Until he takes a spear to the face.
That's it.
Oh, very good defence there with the spear, with the circling motion. He needs to go high-low. High-low! He does it! Everyone here has done loads of longsword. This guy adopts a high ox guard. He gets in. Zwerchhau, victory. Another longsworder giving it a go. Oh, that was very honest of him. Yellow socks. He makes a grab for the spear. He's only one hand on his... Oh, and he's dead. He's determined to win one back. And he does. Ooh, that would hurt your thumb a bit, but yes, stitch that. Big, scary swings, and he's skewered. Big, impressive swings, but they are predictable. The man with the shield has a huge advantage. He should be able to charge down the spearman, and there's not a lot the spearman can do. But the longer he hangs back out of his own range, but in the spearman's range, the more chances the spearman has to land a hit. Which eventually he does. And knows what to do. Charge in, keep going, job done. This guy blinds himself, lowers his shield, and it's over. Massive haymaker, dead. Pinklegs is doing well here, keeping him back with varied thrusts. He goes low, gets him in the knee there, draws the shield down, then goes high and lands a good thrust to the throat. You can see by how much the head bends that that would have been fatal. But it doesn't register, and as Redtrue's attacks with his right hand, he swings his shield out to his left, exposing himself, and he gets speared. Gets in and doesn't stop. That's how to do it. And again, the spearman is doomed. Spearman winds in well and lands a hit. He halts, kneels, blinds himself with his own shield. I don't think anyone here had fought with one-handed spear before. Fancy Pants should win this. The one-handed spear is easy to fend off with a shield and doesn't have the lateral strength to force its way through a determined guard. A lefty. This gave him a slight advantage in attacking the swordsman's open side, but not enough to offset the drawbacks of one-handed spear.
Spear and shield didn't do so well, but the spear used by itself did pretty well. But spear and shield was used all over the world for thousands of years by lots of different cultures. So, is it rubbish?
No, it's not rubbish because it was used with a shield in large formations. If you've got a man either side of you who can skewer anyone trying to close with you, then you can keep yourself safe, you see.
Now spearmen who have no idea what they're doing against a charge of vengeful expert swordsmen. And the spearmen win. Second bout, and well, it's all very confused. But the spearmen win again. Bout 3, and out of the chaos comes a third spear victory, with a little encouragement from me.
Quick! Spearman!
See you there. Now, the swordsmen are not required to start by attacking from the front.
Good.
One swordsman gets round behind, takes out his man, and that decides the issue quickly. Again, I suggest to the spearmen a preemptive countercharge, and this time they heeded me a bit.
Very nice.
Them, in fact, had never, as far as I can tell, held a spear in their lives.
Yes, but I think that was part of the interesting experiment because clearly people actually, you know, if you imagine levies, for example, given here you go, you're forced into do military service. Here's your spear.
Right.
This is how you use it.
All of those people were very familiar with the use of the sword. And a lot of them had never used a spear, and those who had used a spear hadn't used it much. And there were swordsmen who should have been taking those guys apart who were not doing so. I would say from when I did reenactment many years ago, I was doing it, we would fight every week for about 4 years. So I did a lot of work with spear and shield. And if you were on your own with spear and shield against someone with sword and shield, you were dead. However, of course, when we were fighting, we didn't just have the spear, we had a sword dangling from our waist as well. So when we realized, oh, he's got me, we would just drop the spear and then draw a sword. Mm-hmm. So the formation armed with spears would always beat swordsmen because the spearmen were also swordsmen. So the formation armed with spears would always beat swordsmen. So the formation armed with spears would always beat swordsmen. It remains the case that the spears usually won.
That if you can use a spear as an individual weapon, even in a duel situation, if it was an option, choose the spear over the sword most of the time.
It's pretty handy, and of course you can always have a dagger and a hatchet or some secondary backup weapon if the guy does manage to close with you.
A lot of the time these blows wouldn't have any effect through the clothing or through the armour that's being worn, but a spear very often will, because it's a long, rigid object with a point on the end, with a fair amount of mass and body behind it.
And even if it doesn't puncture you, whereas a draw cut or whatever doesn't sort of stop you in your tracks physically, a fierce thrust straight into you will stop you even if it doesn't puncture you.
Absolutely, yeah. So the reach advantage of a spear is the obvious, that's what it really comes down to, isn't it? It's the fact that the person with the spear can hit the person with the sword, when the person with the sword can only try and close distance.
Interesting. So not one spear thrown. And the only time these experts suggest using the backup sidearm They didn't suggest throwing the spear because the opponent would be too close by then anyway. As you can clearly see, the spear is not designed for throwing. The spear can block and stab and reach much better than swords in a lot of cases. In fact, it seems most cases. The inexperienced spearmen beat the highly experienced swordmen at about 2-1. And that's just for duels. In formation, they're even more devastating. It's like trying to poke a porcupine with a thumbtack.
Spears are, in fact, designed to be a throwing weapon. The spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted.
Really? No armies use spears to jab or thrust repeatedly, huh? Well, aside from the fact that literally every source on spears describes them as thrusting weapons, let's look at the primary historical sources, shall we?
I know more than you. All right.
Polybius said hoplites didn't do much in the way of launching missiles at each other, or protection from them would be more important. Arrows and javelins in general seem to be ineffective against hoplites, so why would they choose such ineffective weapons as a main attack against each other? Archilochus himself used a single spear, not throwing spear. The spear was primarily meant for thrusting, Nephy. In art, hoplites are depicted as using spears to stab, not to throw. Also, art is Nephy's gold standard for evidence. As we know from his beliefs in giants and dinosaurs and dragons, if it's depicted in art, it happened. Warriors throughout time and culture are depicted with spear as their main non-throwing weapon. Nephy should be familiar with spears, as it's said that his Lord and Savior was stabbed by one. Does he think that the spear of Longinus was thrown into Jesus? Euripides describes a duel where spears are used exclusively for stabbing, yet again, and swords are only used once they break each other's spears. A similar account is described by Theocritus. Now, these are just fictional characters fighting, so it just reflects the expectations of the time. But what about eyewitness accounts? We have those. Xenophon, an Athenian military commander, describes two shield walls approaching each other and attempting to stab each other repeatedly with spears. This is a guy who trained these spearmen. So, Nephy, why weren't they throwing their spears? Xenophon actually witnessed these battles and says that they walked around jabbing each other, Neph. Xenophon also describes spears being stabbed at waist level, definitely not throwing position. In one particularly brutal battle, he describes swords as being used, but only because all the spears were broken. Not because the battle was heavy. Spears are still preferable in tense battle. It isn't the intensity of battle that necessitates swords. It's the intensity that causes broken spears, and the lack of spears that causes sword use. At least in this type of warfare. But again, Neph is making an absolute statement that applies to all warfare, and that's why he's so wrong. Yes, the Greeks very well might have thrown spears in first contact. However, it is beyond clear that a spear was used for stabbing, preferably over swords, even if spears were thrown initially. Neph says the spear is only used for throwing and the sword is the main melee weapon. This is clearly false. Even if they throw spears, they still use spears as melee weapons. The addition of the spike to the hoplite spears at the back of the spear suggested a transition away from throwing spears. The butt spike would make it more difficult to throw and would essentially give the soldiers two spears in one, making the carrying of extra spears unnecessary, since a broken shaft could make use of the still deadly butt spike if it broke and lost the main spear tip. The evidence suggests that spears lasted long into the fight too, so it was not a weapon that typically broke early in battle. Euripides, the father of Xenophon, had his messenger describe the first thrust of the Argive spears. First thrust? But then wouldn't that imply there was a second thrust? And wouldn't that imply spears jabbing and jabbing over and over? How can you thrust if you throw your spear? That's the first and only thrust. I focus on the Greeks because there are good accounts, and all I need to defeat Nephy's claims is one example, because his claims are absolutes. But one example shows how it would be used in many cultures, as the physics of weapons remains the same, although European treatises also show that spears are for stabbing and describe fencing with spears, contrary to Neph's claims that they are designed only for throwing, and that no culture used them for stabbing. In the contents of Liberi and Vadi's treatises, we only see reference to throwing the spear as one technique among many, many thrusting techniques. Plus, it also says to throw your sword. And we also see a bizarre anti-spear tactic that involves throwing a club at the spearman. We see throwing of everything from rocks to swords and clubs. Spears are not unique in this regard. Exploring the usage of swords as backup weapons, we see that they're less effective in certain formations, and thus are only backup weapons because, while they offer lateral attacks, something the Romans could excel at because of their shields and armor, and the uniformity that they could afford in that respect, there was little need to slash sideways in dense formations outside of the Roman tactic, and when pushing against another shield wall, little chance for sword use. In these formations and out of formations, it was much more handy to strike from afar at the opponent's face, or dispatch him on the ground with a spear. You can imagine you wouldn't need to stoop to stab your opponent on the ground with a spear, while you would need to bend over in some manner to do so with a sword. And the reach has obvious advantage when stabbing at the face. The underhand grip also offered better stabbing power from above and did not disturb your fellow soldiers to your side, allowing you to keep tight formations of a nigh impenetrable shield wall. The advantages of the sword were typically negated by the confines of the closely knit phalanx, and offered less penetration power, and slashing is always slower than stabbing. And spear jabbing is much more unpredictable, and you can change direction much more quickly. That's why there was no ancient Greek word for swordsman. But again, I have to keep stressing this, it's context dependent. Spear and shield are weak outside of formation, while a single two-handed spear can easily defeat a sword and shield in a duel. Now, I didn't have to go back to the eyewitness accounts, because literally everyone should know this, but just to prove the absolute depths of your wrongness, I went the extra mile just for you, so that there's exactly zero room for doubt.
Bitch.
Spears are not the mainstay weapon of any soldier, never have been.
False. Spears were main weapons. Swords were backup weapons in most situations. The spear is described as the hoplite weapon par excellence. Euripides even goes as far as to declare that once a spear is lost, there's nothing to defend with. This is clearly a bit of an exaggeration, but in a moment, we will see the defensive usage of a spear in hoplite shield walls, and we'll see why someone would not be happy if they lost it.
No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab.
False again. Spears are constantly described by contemporaries as thrusting weapons. Now, the Greek hoplites and other cultures made extensive use of javelins, but Neph is claiming that spears were exclusively for throwing, were never main weapons, and were never used for stabbing repeatedly. Even though literally all sources, including the primary contemporary eyewitnesses of Greek warfare, report the precise opposite of what Neph claims. Spears were used close quarters, but could not be thrown close quarters.
Αν δεχόμαστε χτυπήματα από δόρια από μία φάλαγγα που έχουμε απέναντί μας, ένα αντίπαλο δόρυ που έρχεται προς το πρόσωπό μου, είμαι αναγκασμένος να αμυνθώ με το δόρυ. Αυτός ο τρόπος με τον οποίο το χειρίζομαι μπορεί να μου δώσει ταυτόχρονα και άμυνα και επίθεση. Δηλαδή μπορώ να κρατήσω στόχευση προς ένα σημείο που είχα ορίσει εκεί πέρα που βλέπω κάποιο άνοιγμα και συγχρόνως να μετακινήσω το δόρυ μου για να μείνετε. Μπορώ να διώχνω άλλα δόρια και να τρυπάνω. Αν το κρατούσα ανάποδα, αυτό δεν θα ήταν δυνατό να συμβεί. Γιατί το δόρυ μου παίρνει μια κλίση προς τα έξω. Δηλαδή θα σημάδευα περισσότερο. Με αυτόν τον τρόπο έχω αρκετά εκτεθειμένη τη μασχάλη μου. Σε χτυπήματα. Την ώρα που προσπαθώ να αμυνθώ, κοιτάξτε πώς εκτίθεται η μασχάλη μου εδώ. Σε σχέση με αυτόν τον τρόπο, και να κλείνω όσα χρόνια και να έχω, μπορώ να ανοίγω και να χτυπάω χωρίς να δείχνω το άνοιγμα που έχω στην πανοπλία μου.
The spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted.
It's designed to simply push through the enemy with dozens of sharp spikes, forcing them backwards. And this, I mean, you can just, imagine this face on, and you can imagine just how dangerous this thing would have been if it was coming at you. You are still nowhere near the man who is stabbing you at this point. And if you were to get slightly further, you'd find other people trying to stab you, rank upon rank upon rank. And so a dense Macedonian phalanx is one of the most difficult and dangerous things that you can encounter. And this is what the Romans said when they were conquering Macedon. Paulus, the Roman general Paulus, one of the generals at the Battle of Pydna, which was a Roman victory. It was a near-run thing, though, and the Romans had many battles against Macedonians, had 3 Macedonian wars. But Paulus rent his garments as he witnessed his legions falling back before the devastating onslaught of the Macedonian phalanx. And the phalanx, he would later say, was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen in his life.
Nephi claims that the sword is the primary battlefield weapon in ancient and medieval times because the standard battlefield process is to throw the spear first to open the battle. Then you draw your swords for the rest of the battle. If these men had thrown their spears in an opening salvo, this entire tactic would have fallen apart. Plus, these are 20-foot spears. You can't throw them. They can only be used for thrusting. Neph understands literally nothing about ancient and medieval warfare.
Spears are, in fact, designed to be a throwing weapon. The spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted.
I don't know why Neph ignores the fact that the spears were designed both for thrusting and for throwing. He's quite insistent on the fact that they're made only for throwing, though. Thrusting with spears is quite possibly the most well-founded of all historical facts.
Spears. The spears are not the mainstay weapon of any soldier, never have been. The only people known to hold spears in battle for any length of time was the Romans when they formed their formations. The spear is a primary attack weapon. You throw it, you take out 1, maybe 2 guys right off the bat. Then
you don't throw it right off the bat. It's not used right.
He gets rid of the spear or throws it, and then he pulls out his sword, usually a short sword. The spear is a primary attack weapon, and then it's discarded, and they resort to a sword or a knife. The spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted. The spear was used to be thrown, and then you pull out the sword.
Let's hear it. We've got, there's a lot of points there.
You know, it's amazing. You are 100% wrong. I mean, nothing you've said has been right.
Again, he acts like he's studied in this when he just watches movies and plays around in his loony fantasy world that only exists in his feeble little mind. This is like telling us that the pistol is the primary weapon of a soldier and that the function of his rifle is just to throw at the enemy to initiate the battle. But no, the sword, like the pistol, is a sidearm to be used if you lose your primary weapon. The spear was actually the primary weapon in warfare for most of history in most cultures and in most battles. It doesn't look as cool as swords in movies, though, and as we know, Nephi gets all of his facts, literally, from fiction. If you threw away your primary weapon in favor of your backup weapon, that would actually play out exactly the same way in modern times as in ancient times, and in fact, might be worse in ancient times. Consider the Greek hoplites. Their primary weapon was a super long spear that they used in formation to stab people at a distance. Imagine them throwing these spears now. Then you'd go from having a reach advantage to just being on equal footing, swordsman versus swordsman. Not only do they lose the reach advantage and have to engage the enemy close up, but the enemy now has the spears and can stab them back at a range where the sword cannot reach them. Do you see how many attempts it takes for one shot to land? Why would you restrict yourself to just one shot by throwing your spear when you could just keep it in your hand and keep stabbing?
I stab and stab. I love stabbing.
Sounds like you like stabbing.
After all the stabbing...
It's repetitive.
The spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted.
I can't express how asinine this idea is. There's no word for the level of sheer ignorance on display here. Nephi acts like one shot with a spear is all you need. No real need to repeatedly stab with a spear, because it's not like the enemy has shields or anything they can block with, right? Not like you need to actually like fight them and wait for openings and stab over and over again trying to find a weakness and try again. No, just one and done. Just wow. Spears as thrusting weapons is clearly the consensus. Now, swords were used as primary weapons by some cultures, especially out of formation. Again, they're more like everyday sidearms, best for individual skirmishes and self-defense, as you go about your normal day, rather than, like, actual warfare. People walk around with pistols on their hips. People walked around with swords on their hips. It isn't very convenient to walk around with a spear all day, but smaller sidearms, sure, just strap it to your hip. But for warfare, you're going to want something a little more heavy duty, like a spear or a polearm of some kind.
The only people known to hold spears in battle for any length of time was the Romans when they formed their formations.
The Romans did the exact opposite, and they were the exception, not the rule. It is true that the Romans would throw javelins at their enemies and then take out their primary weapons, the gladius-type swords. This was partially because they have essentially full-body shields and pretty advanced armor. They could defeat the reach of spears with their level of armor, which was unprecedented at the time, so they didn't really need to outreach the spears. Romans specialized in getting close, and because of how heavily armored they were pretty much immune to spears.
This is a legion in testudo formation, but you can see that the shields are large enough to cover the body, and the whole point of the Roman formation here, the manipular formation, was it was effectively like a phalanx with joints. The shields didn't need to overlock because they were big enough that they essentially covered the entire man anyway, and so it gave the legion a lot more flexibility than they would otherwise have had. And this was the downfall of the Macedonian phalanx. On even ground, it's very easy to keep a very tight formation, and you can simply just keep pushing forward and push your opponent back. But if at all the phalanx is broken up, then small groups of men carrying shields and short swords like the Romans did can get in very, very close and just start stabbing relentlessly and hacking and chopping. And this was the Macedonian report after some of these battles. They were just shocked at the wounds that the Romans were able to inflict with these short swords, and the fact that they could just use these shields to get into the phalanx and actually eat it up from within itself.
It was the shields, not the swords, that allowed for this close combat.
But it was never something that was just, oh, that was easy, that was inevitable. I don't think there was anything easy or inevitable about it. I think it was quite a difficult job for the Romans by all accounts. But the flexibility of the legions were what allowed them to overwhelm the phalanxes and eat them out from the inside, which is not something they could actually do to a normal Greek phalanx. You didn't have those options. I mean, if you've got an 18-foot long spear, when someone gets within that, you've got to pull out your little short sword. And the Macedonians had a small buckler that they had across their left arm and hung on their shoulder, but it's not nearly the equivalent of the hand-to-hand combat equipment that the Romans had.
By getting past the long spears, the Romans could force them to be at a disadvantage fighting with swords. Why would the Macedonians throw away their best defense and offense?
The Macedonian phalanx is not like the Greek phalanx. I think this is just a point that people are not truly appreciating, because it really does turn the Greek phalanx into a really offensive weapon, and it's the sort of thing that does a huge amount of damage.
He gets rid of the spear or throws it, and then he pulls out his sword, usually a short sword. The spear is a primary attack weapon, and then it's discarded, and they resort to a sword or a knife.
It was actually the Romans who used swords as primary weapons, which Gilgamesh was not a Roman. However, Romans carried at least 2 pila, their version of the javelin. This is because they expected to throw them. With a proper war spear, in contrast, people didn't carry 2 of them, because they were for thrusting and stabbing, and javelin throwers formed separate detached units. Sometimes hoplites carried a spear and a smaller javelin, and this is depicted in art, further proving, by Neph's own standards, that these are 2 different spears with 2 different usages, and you can clearly see that the smaller one is meant for throwing, since it has a strap.
He gets rid of the spear or throws it, and then he pulls out his sword, usually a short sword. The spear is discarded, and they resort to a sword or a knife.
Imagine the pivotal tactic, its core strength of a phalanx being thrown away in the first minutes of a battle.
He gets rid of the spear or throws it, and then he pulls out his sword, usually a short sword. The spear is a primary attack weapon, and then it's discarded, and they resort to a sword or a knife.
Secondary backup weapon.
If spears broke, not discarded. Neph is describing what Romans did, and they were successful with this tactic, specifically because they faced certain enemies who were usually unarmored or had hugely oversized spears as their main weapon. And so once you closed that distance, and the Romans could because of how heavily armored they were, they couldn't really do anything about it because they had small shields, and the spears were way too long to just maneuver inside of the formation. This wouldn't have been an issue for the Macedonians if the fighting style was to throw the spear, which would be impossible for spears that big, and in that tight of formation, you'd knock your comrades in the face just trying to wind up to throw it. The Macedonians recorded being shocked at the tactic of using swords as a main weapon because they were accustomed to using spears for the duration of their battle. Also, the Roman pila were designed to penetrate and disable shields via throwing. They were atypical in how narrow they were, more like giant arrows. So even if he was just talking about javelins only, when Nephi says...
The spear is a primary attack weapon. You throw it, you take out one, maybe two guys right off the bat. Then
you don't throw it right off the bat. It's not used right.
Which is just not true. He doesn't even get that right. He isn't even talking about how Roman throwing spears or javelins are supposed to be used. You can tell he's just getting all of his information from watching movies. Light units throwing javelins will have lots of javelins, and they'll pester their enemy over and over again at a distance with missiles, like javelins and arrows. Heavy javelin units like the Romans use javelins to disable shields in their enemy's front line before closing with swords. You don't need that many javelins in that case. They're almost guaranteed to stick in a shield because you're not aiming to kill people with the javelin. You're aiming to take out their shields so you can stab them. And again, they can go straight into melee because of how heavily armored they are, and this was rarely the case in most armies until the late medieval and Renaissance period, and even then full heavy armor was just for the knights and lords. But Nephi isn't just talking about Romans. He categorically states that the spear as a weapon itself is essentially a throwing weapon.
The spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted. The spear was used to be thrown, and then you pull out the sword. Spears are, in fact, designed to be a throwing weapon.
He's equivocating spears and javelins. You wouldn't throw your spears away in the first moments of a skirmish. What would you defend against cavalry charges with, Neph? What would you use? How would you counter your enemy's spears if you can't even reach them without getting stabbed yourself? The Romans had a specific counter to this that no other military at the time did or could even afford. This only became a widespread thing in the late medieval periods when full-body, hardened plate armor offered pretty much immunity from stabbing and slashing weapons. Even then, the primary weapons became maces, halberds, and huge heavy swords for the purposes of crushing armor, at least against the knightly classes. Still no throwing of spears. They still needed them to kill cavalry charges. The projectiles were arrows and crossbow bolts because they're easier to aim, easier to carry, way more ammunition for them. They're smaller, so they're better at penetrating both armor and the gaps in armor. Xenophon also describes bows and javelins as servile weapons fit only for mercenaries, and that spears intended for close combat could be used effectively by men who had no training, so that the average man could join the fight. Now, I will say that spears could be gripped in the middle so that they could be thrown a short distance, but then the shaft would still be in grabbing distance to be recovered, like so. You would throw it, sort of, but it's still in your hand. And most of the shaft is still there so you can grab it again, so it can be reused. But this isn't what Nephi is describing at all. He literally said that you throw your spear, discard it, and then draw your sword for the rest of the battle. Also, spears tend to be longer than javelins and heavier than javelins because they're designed to have reach and be sturdier. They're not designed to be thrown away. Javelins are designed to be thrown away. Javelins don't need to be heavy or long because their reach comes from, you guessed it, being thrown.
Spears are, in fact, designed to be a throwing weapon. That's why they're so long, because it makes them aerodynamic. It makes the weapon fly straighter when it's thrown. That's why they have a long... Imagine trying to throw a spear that's 2 feet long. It's not going to go very straight, right? But when you have the weight behind the head, then it goes straight. That's why it's designed to be thrown, okay? A spear is designed to be strong. No ancient culture running around with spears and jabbing forward and back and jab and jab and jab. That's not how warfare was conducted.
Word salad. He says some stuff about counterbalancing as if it makes any sense within the context of phalanx trying to operate without spears, or the fact that many spear designs cannot be used as throwing weapons at all, both because of the size, weight, and length, and also how they're used in formation. Macedonian spears were two-handed weapons, so not throwing weapons. And javelins are typically smaller spears. As usual, the opposite of what Nephi says. And no, the Roman javelins, the Greek javelins, the Maya javelins, the African javelins, etc., all were shorter than your standard fighting spear. Nephi also claims that the longer a spear is, the more stable it is mid-flight after being thrown. Not only is this physically unfounded, the longer it is, the heavier it is, and the harder it is to throw, but no, the longer the spear is, the more it's designed to be used in a stable fighting position and retained as the primary weapon. See how these hoplites are holding like 20-foot spears that poke out the front still, even though they're held by people who are 4 or 5 rows back? That's what a spear is for. Reaching. Like I said before, this spear issue wasn't even the topic of the debate, but Neph is so narcissistic and insecure that he's just going on and on and on and on and will not give an inch on it, and doubling down because Jim had the audacity to correct him on some offhanded comment he had, and it spiraled into this whole thing. That's why Jim is just like, whatever, okay, let's move on.
It was designed as a stab and jab from afar weapon that can be thrown. It's I mean, yeah, but anyways, so there's no archaeological evidence for giants, period. Just the claim that there are people who were tall or men of renown or heroes of old. None of that necessitates that they're 15, 20, 30 feet tall as you claim.
Well, I don't believe they were 30 feet tall, but you're wrong about spears.
Just 20.
Spears are, in fact, designed to be a throwing weapon. That's why they're so long, because it makes them aerodynamic. It makes the weapon fly straighter when it's thrown. That's why they have a long... Imagine trying to throw a spear that's 2 feet long. It's not going to go very straight, right? But when you have the weight behind the head, then it goes straight. That's why it's designed to be thrown. Spear was used to be thrown, and then you pull out the sword.
You, my friend, are just a few plums short of a fruit pie.
But Neph needs to convince himself that he can never be wrong. So he just drones on and on and on, trying to justify the verbal turds flopping out of his pie hole. Because he thinks he can just convince everyone he's right if he's just super confident about one of the most obviously wrong statements I've ever heard. It's clear that spears being used for repeating thrusting and stabbing across culture is the consensus, but Nephi isn't one for consensus in pretty much any of his positions. They also describe fencing with hoplite weapons, meaning sword and spear. How does one fence with a weapon intended exclusively for throwing, Neph? The spear eventually evolved to be a fusion of axe, pick, and long skinny armor-penetrating pike, known as the extremely badass halberd. Now, yes, there were many scenarios where short swords and daggers were used, but Neph categorically claims that spears are not used as stabbing weapons, but exclusively as throwing weapons, even though they're universally described as both throwing and thrusting, but mainly thrusting weapons. Which hopefully I've beaten into viewers' skulls at this point. If this guy can't even do 10 minutes of research into the most basic weapon in existence, imagine the kind of egregious mistakes he'll make when trying to insist he knows genetics and tries to lecture us on genetics, and he does. If anyone watching isn't already familiar with NephilimFree here, believe me, it gets worse. By the way, even chimpanzees know how to use thrusting spears when Nephy doesn't, so another point for evolution. The reason I made this video was to show how confident someone can be, the maximum level of confidence here, while simultaneously being as wrong as it is humanly possible to be, especially when it's beyond easy to fact-check himself. As usual, Nephy is the king of Dunning-Kruger, and he keeps the throne. For now. Anyway, glad to get that off my chest. God bless.